for taking the time today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Awesome. Well, listen, I'd love to kick things off here today by going back to your rookie year when you came into the NFL, 1999 with the Philadelphia Eagles. What was it like, that transition for you from college to the pros, not only on the physical side, but maybe more importantly on the mental side?
So I played football at UC Berkeley, and I was fortunate enough to graduate in 4 years, and I worked on my master's in my fifth year. And when I got drafted, I was drafted the second pick in the fourth round, and I came in and ended up starting as a rookie. And I will tell you that the transition between high school and college was dramatically more difficult and just such a bigger hoop to jump through than going from the NFL to going from college to the NFL. When I was 18 years old, I was 6'4", 265 pounds, and didn't even own a razor. And by the time I left college, I had grown 2 inches, and I was 6'6" and weighed over 300 pounds, and ended up shaving then. So I think just like the maturation process takes time. And then when I got to the NFL, I came in and there was a bunch of older guys in front of me, and I went in and played pretty well. And when I came back after minicamp, they had cut all those old guys, and I was the starter. So the transition really wasn't that big going from college to the NFL as it was from really high school to college. So and then when I was in college, I was a rhetoric major, like in English philosophy, but I wanted a minor, and I was really interested in nutrition.
Cool.
And ended up not being able to get the minor because all of the labs were in the afternoon when I had football practice. So I took all the classes that I needed for it other than the labs. And so I thought I had a pretty solid foundation of nutrition going in. And it wasn't until I got to the NFL in my rookie year, I got hooked up with a supplement deal. I met a guy named Mauro Di Pasquale, who was a doctor out of Canada.
Yeah, there you go.
Probably know. So Mauro hooked me up with my first supplement deal, and we got on the phone. He sent me his book, which I read, and I remember reading his anabolic and metabolic diet books and thinking that everything that I had just learned the previous 4 years in college, based off of what I was reading there, was completely wrong. And he was, he's really the father of the carb cycling and the cyclical ketogenic diets, and he was doing that. And it's hilarious to see it now because it's all just variations of what he did. And he, we had a pretty decent amount of conversations about it. And it took a little bit of convincing on my part because naturally I'm just, I'm like a conscientious objector. Like I'll go along, but like, you got to convince me a little bit. And, and then, having a background in nutrition and then obviously a degree in rhetoric, which was like analytical kind of a pre-law degree. There was just a lot of questions. And finally I got to, this kind of fork in the road, and I always had this idea in my mind that I'm always trying to be a white belt. I always want to be a beginner.
Yeah.
And I wrote a blog post about this, about like, if you're always the guru in the room, go find a new room. So I just kind of like said, hey, write it out for me. What do you think I should do? I'll follow it to a T. And that was when I really kind of dove in and, started really looking at like, protein as, as probably the one macronutrient for body composition and recovery and for strength. And then looking at how we cycled carbohydrates and fats and really doing like I think I was like 24, maybe 30 days we did on the keto with no carb. And then like, I remember we started doing those carb refeeds. And at the end of that, let me see, that was probably in September. And then by, I would say January or February or March, I had pretty much like reconfigured my body, if you could say that. I was probably, 310, 312 pounds, 20% body fat, pretty, normal, what you'd expect to see from an offensive lineman coming out of college. And then in that second year, all of a sudden I was, 306 pounds, except I was 10% body fat. And at the time, I was the only guy that they'd ever tested over 300 pounds that was 10% in the or I was less than 10% in the bod pod.
So, I mean, that's saying something for sure. And going back to that time, the nutrition support and focus in the NFL at that time, that must have obviously been pretty different from what the general recommendations were for the rest of the guys. No, in terms of your first year being a lineman, can you talk a little bit about that and how if there was any conflicting, with staff or whatnot in terms of the path you were taking?
No, we didn't really there really wasn't any nutrition recommendations. We didn't have a dietitian. We obviously had strength coaches, who were more, Penn State high, hit guys, which was
Yep.
kind of interesting for me because I came from a, pretty classical powerlifting background. But then my strength coach in college was a guy named Todd Rice, who was as far as you could go in terms of like Olympic lifting. So for the last 3 years of college, all I did was front squat, snatch, clean, and jerk, and we did plyos and sprinted.
Yeah.
So it was a really different environment. And, all the stuff that I really knew about diet, obviously learning in the class was, coming out of like Flex magazine. I was like, oh, I got to eat 18 chicken breasts a day. And I was eating, white rice and, black beans.
Yep.
And, then I remember to like make up my calories because I had a certain caloric load that I had to hit. I remember I'd do like shots of olive oil. So, staying with like monounsaturated fats because, you can't have too much saturated fat, which, was pretty interesting thinking back about the nutrition I learned in college. There was this idea that like saturated fat was like the veritable boogeyman who's going to steal your wallet, get your girlfriend pregnant and like, burn your house down.
There you go.
And it was really fascinating when I met Mauro and read all of his books and then went back and, this is kind of like, I'd say, archaic internet where, I ended up having to go to the library, which is what I had done in college, and microfiche and, you're going through this and I went back and I pulled a bunch of research and, there was a bunch of correlations with low blood serum cholesterol levels and suicide and impotence and male, and like, low muscle mass. And, even though our bodies produce more saturated fat in a single day than we could ever consume, diets of low saturated fat don't bode well for people that want to have healthy androgen profiles. And so, seeing what Mauro was talking about, with, hey, we're going to eat a ton of red meat and there's going to be saturated fat. And like the saturated fat is really going to be this catalyst and the amount of volume and everything that we're doing for training. And, it was really interesting just because they didn't get into that stuff. And, it was like, hey, we're going to eat a ton of, cruciferous vegetables. And it just like, I think back about how far ahead he was because it's, as with nutrition, it's so cyclical. Like, I remember in 2008, 2009, 2010, maybe it was 2009, I met Rob Wolf, who wrote the paleo diet. And he started talking to me about this thing called the paleo diet. And he's going through, I'm like, you realize that's how I've eaten my entire NFL career. And I was like, I met this guy named Mauro Di Pasquale and we started talking and Rob's head like exploded. And he's like, dude, you were, and I was pretty lucky. I've always counted this as kind of maybe just, I don't know, the Forrest Gump, paradox where just out of proximity and just luck, there were a lot of things that fell into play to allow me to play in the NFL. Like my older brothers were all big, strong dudes and they played college football. And when I was about 14 years old, I was pretty skinny, pretty thin. And there was an old power lifter down the road who used to lift weights in his garage. And he invited me to come lift weights. And he turned out to be like the U.S. powerlifting coach. And he was like this world-class power lifter.
Incredible.
And I was lucky. I trained in his garage. A guy named George Zangus. He invented the super suits and the wraps and had this company called Marathon Nutrition. So like, I'm like, it's like 1989, 1990, and he's giving us boxes of this stuff called creatine. And it was like, hey, I want you to take this creatine. So I always joke that I'm the longest continuous creatine user on the planet since 1990. I've been taking it.
Case study right there.
Yeah. And so when people were talking about, creatine being this bad thing, I'm like, dude, I got like, what's that? Like over 30 years of taking creatine every single day without any issues. So, and now all of a sudden the research comes out that it improves ATP and brain function and like every, human on the planet should take it. And I'm like, man, I've been saying that for 30 years. So it's,
definitely really interesting. I mean, you hit on some points there around, things like saturated fat intake. Even today is obviously hotly debated in academic circles, whether we go above or below 10%. And, ironic because places like Spain, where they consume the most, are soon to be the longest living folks in the world. And, you talk about Di Pasquale as well, steaks and whatnot. I mean, people even fail to realize that things like almonds, 100 grams of almonds has more saturated fat than a steak. And so there's a lot of things that are, sort of go unnoticed in the nutrition circles, as you mentioned there. But if we talk about back to that first year, when you're starting this diet, that Mauro was giving you, obviously you're probably a little bit hesitant at first. Like, what were some of the experiences that you had in the early days?
So it was pretty amazing. you see how like if I can frame this, it's obvious like it's been a couple years, but I remember Mauro sent me the diet, and I think I was eating, man, I was probably eating well over 350 grams of protein just from red meat, and then supplementing with olive oil and coconut oil and like whatever else I could. He wasn't real big on like butter and lard and that stuff. It was always this kind of balance of like, hey, you're getting so much saturated fat from like, obviously the steaks and whatnot.
Yeah.
So let's balance it out with like coconut oil and olive oil. And then I ate a ton of cruciferous vegetables with it. And I felt phenomenal. Like I always wonder if, like maybe I'd had some blood sugar issues, excess body fat, and if I just did a talk for the NSCA on metabolic flexibility, and I had, not to take a little bit of a side turn, but
Sure.
I had this theory a couple years ago that like metabolic flexibility and the idea of like, being able to test people for metabolic flexibility would help us figure out like what the most optimal diet was. And after a couple of years of research, I realized that the most metabolically flexible people are usually the people that carry the most amount of lean muscle mass and the lowest body fat. So like, whatever diet you can to get you there. So I did that, and I remember Mauro's recommendation was like 9 days, and he pushed it out to like 24, where I was pretty much no carb. And I remember it was like a Friday, and I remember he like emailed me or we talked or something, and he's like, hey, tomorrow I want you to get up in the morning. I want you to go bang some heavy weights. And then I want you to come home. I don't want you to eat anything for a couple hours, like, get like a good fast in, and then find some Italian restaurant. I want you to go and I want you to eat as like, carbs. Like I want you to eat pasta, bread.
Go for it, right?
Like, yeah, like I want you to go out and like eat till you're full. And I was like, oh, okay. So I went to this Italian spot. I lived over in Center City, and over in Rittenhouse, there was this Italian spot I went to. And I sat down and I like started ordering, and the lady's like, are you waiting on anybody? And I was like, no, this is for me. She was like, oh, Jesus. And so comes over, brings like this huge pizza, probably like easily like 2 pounds of pasta, meatballs, the whole nines. And I sit down and start just like eating. And as I was eating, like it was like a bottomless pit almost. And I'm really like a crappy big eater. Like, Luke and some of the guys, like Luke who works for me has like that FTO gene where like he can like swallow an obscene amount of food. For me, like when my stomach hits the limit, like I feel uncomfortable and just want to go home. So like I tend to always eat one bite hungry, not one bite full. Yeah. And, but to try to be a big dude, that means I just had to eat a lot more often. So as I sit down, I start crushing it, and like I eat like 2-3 pounds of pasta. I eat this massive, like large pizza. I ate breadsticks. Like I crushed it. And I remember as I was eating the pasta, I started sweating so bad that I was like dripping sweat in the food, which is pretty disgusting. And like as the lady comes over, I remember the waitress comes over and she's like, "Are you okay?" I'm like, "Why?" She's like, "Well, you're sweating so bad, And like she's trying to talk to me, and I'm like, "I'm doing this diet and I'm carb loading." And she like looked at me like I had 3 heads. And
as long as you're okay.
She's like, "Don't stroke out and die."
Yeah.
So I walk out of that place. And I was like about a 3 or 4 block walk. And I remember like just being like, man, I feel like pretty good. And I remember went home, and all of a sudden, like 30 minutes later, it was like a ninja blow dart, like somebody roofied me. I was just so tired. I like went right to sleep, probably about 8:30. And I woke up the next morning, let's say at like 5 or 6. I remember I went to the bathroom, and I remember I had like a vein in my ab. And I was like, holy shit, I look like dramatically leaner than I was the night before. And I remember hitting up Doc and telling him, and he's like, that's good. He goes, what I want you to do is I want you to eat carbs over the course of these 2 days. But after every meal, I want you to kind of take a look. And if you still look pretty lean and vascular, keep eating. If you start to bloat out, or you start to look like a little more full where you kind of look smooth, stop the carbs. You're done. And then we'll kind of go back. And so he really coached me on it. And I'm not kidding you. Like it like remodeled my body. Like I always tell people that the person you see today, like all that foundational work and everything I had, like it remodeled me. And I remember I showed up that next, when I came in for that second year, people like were like, didn't even recognize me. And, they like asked me what I did. And I'm like, dude, I've been really hammering my diet. I've been training. The training's been really good. And, I obviously figured out that I was a better player at about 305, 306 than I was at about 310, 315, 320 where they wanted me to play.
Yeah.
And that excess fat didn't help me. And I just recovered better. I felt better. I moved more efficiently, and just, and that was really like opened my eyes to not only nutrition, but then the next piece of that was I met a guy named Tom Incledon, who had a company out in Arizona called Human Performance Specialists. And Tom had worked with a bunch of professional athletes, and we just started getting regular blood work done. And through that blood work is where I really started kind of dialing in like micronutrient deficiencies. As you go back, and I'm sure from all the pathways, like your body doesn't produce testosterone if you're, absent of zinc, magnesium, iron, selenium, copper, and just getting some micronutrient testing done and seeing like, hey, you're deficient here, and then figuring out how to do that was also very, very beneficial for me.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating when you talk about just being able to play better at 305, leaner, less, percent fat than typically the recommendations. Linemen, as most of the guys on your team were probably, that recommended 320, 325, and of course carrying more abdominal fat and visceral fat, which obviously is more pro-inflammatory, and finding where that middle ground is of, wait a minute, that pro-inflammatory environment is going to start impairing things like the recovery piece and maybe how your joints feel. So, as you were going through this from season on season, because you were obviously ahead of the curve here, did you start to notice more offensive linemen starting to shift their diet? And even today, I mean, when you look at the NFL,
no,
what do you see in terms of it still seems like it's,
I think, I've seen a few guys that are in good shape, but I'm not saying this to toot my own horn, but like, consistently, I rarely saw another offensive lineman that was in as good a shape as I was in. And I just don't think that they understood the training the way that I did, and they didn't really monitor their calories. Like, I'll tell you this, I fought tooth and nail against the idea of developing an aerobic base. I figured if I lifted weights and I sprinted and I ran hard and I was, real strong on my glycolytic phase, the anabolic or the aerobic phase would take over. And then I figured the error of my ways. And so, looking at, increasing metabolic or, mitochondrial density through developing a larger aerobic base, and then, obviously lifting heavy weights. And I was fortunate when I started lifting weights, the old man I referenced earlier, George Zangas, his good friend was a guy named Dr. Fred Hatfield, Dr. Squat. And he would talk about his good friend Fred Hatfield and compensatory acceleration, which is as mechanical advantage increases, so does the speed. So like when I lifted weights, we would use compensatory acceleration. And I remember the old man would talk about like, I want you to move the weights violently. I want you to try to break the barbells. And so everything I did, from the time I was 14 in terms of lifting weights, was trying to move every weight, regardless of what was on the bar, with maximal intensity and maximal intent and speed. And that training, I think, really set, like, if you want to say, like, set the metabolic pathways, or really set just a lot of things in play where I felt like, my ability to generate force was dramatically better. And so that's what I was saying, like, kind of what I joke and call it the Forrest Gump conundrum, where I just had some really interesting people in my life early on that kind of set these things in play. But I would talk constantly with other offensive linemen and other players about what I was doing nutritionally. And I sometimes think, man, like, it's called the curse of the gifted, that, like, the better you are and the easier things are, the less I think people have to really buckle down and work. Like, if you just got up and every day you were the fastest, biggest, the strongest, then what does it do? And I think for me, I've always felt like I had to work harder than other people, and I had to explore every avenue. And the nutrition piece was something I was naturally interested in. And, when I looked at Mauro's diet, or when Mauro presented his diet, I'm like, I really like to eat red meat. I'm like, this isn't a stretch for me. And, so it tended to work really well. But what was interesting was, it just kind of taught me, the fact that, because I think coming out of that college environment, there was this idea of, like, I remember them being like, if you don't eat carbs, you'll die.
Definitely.
And that was the prevailing idea. And I remember looking at, like, the Krebs cycle, and if there's not carbohydrate in this, you can't, and then when I met Mauro and I really started looking at some of the ketogenic stuff, I realized that, the body is super adaptable, and your ability to be able to transition between, fat for, low level versus carbohydrate for high level, and really that kind of seamless transition, which we understand now I call metabolic flexibility. That's really the marker for health and performance and strength and all these other key factors. And my ability to kind of switch between those is, predicated not only on, body fat and aerobic base and strength and health and all this, but it's an indicator of like longevity. And so
definitely,
that was very beneficial for me.
Yeah, between the aerobic base and the strength component, I mean, that's definitely some great markers for longevity. And of course, being lean around the midsection, we talked about that. And, being an offensive lineman obviously plays like last, 3 seconds, 5 seconds, maybe a little bit longer sometimes. I mean, that's the perfect environment.
It's 5 to 7 seconds.
5 to 7 seconds, right? So, if you're working with elite football players, professional football players now, offensive linemen in particular, around this nutrition supplementation piece, what are some of the suggestions, recommendations, tips that you're giving your athletes?
What I really do is I base everything around protein. So unless somebody's going to eat an adequate amount of protein, and for me, that's at minimum of 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight. Like if I can get people eating at least 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight, we can start to play with the carbohydrates and the fats really based on taste. I found that for me, when I was younger, and I know this is kind of interesting, I handled saturated fat much better. Like I could eat a huge amount of saturated fat. And now that I'm, in my early 40s, I tend to balance and actually, I'm a little lower on the saturated fat and tend to eat a little bit more carb. And I just wonder if it's because my training volume isn't as high, or maybe I'm, whatever it is. But I just my blood work didn't look as good as when my saturated fat was high compared to when I was younger. And the thing that I'm really pretty lucky about is I started getting blood work done 2, 3, 4 times a year when I was in my 24 years old. So I have 18, 19 years of pretty continuous blood work, so I can look at trends over time.
Yeah, that's terrific. I mean, that's definitely when it really helps.
Well, yeah, I mean, blood work is a snapshot of that moment in time, and one snapshot doesn't show, but when I can show hey, here's 40 tests over 20 18 years, then I can start to see trends, and that's really helpful for me in terms of hey, if I make a twist or a change, or if I do something, I can kind of see it in real time, and so that's always been very beneficial for me. Yeah. But, so let me get back to that. I want to put a tangent, but
no worries.
Yeah. So I base everything around protein, and then really for me, I tend to I had this theory. I worked I still do. I work as a contractor for Naval Special Warfare, and I go in and teach performance for the SEAL teams. We work with the guys on the East Coast and development group, and some of the real tier 1 operators, and the one thing I really started kind of focusing on is how do I make people bulletproof? And when I mean bulletproof, and the analogy I give is, everybody's seen obviously Marvel, and I'm okay, or is it? I think it's Marvel.
Yeah.
With Wolverine. Wolverine gets hurt and he heals instantly. Why do you think he heals so fast? What is his genetic mutation that allows him to heal in real time? And they always kind of look at me like a little, stone-eyed, no idea. I'm he has highly advanced immune system. So your immune system is what formulates your ability to recover, and kind of is the really the tip of the spear in terms of not only recovering from daily stress, but everything is based around immune function. And the window of the immune system is the small intestine. So what I really looked at was how do I look at kind of a diet that avoids kind of things that are inflammatory within the small intestine, and really kind of can help us become ramp up immune function and make us more bulletproof. And so that kind of put me into a deep dive of really looking at how does inflammation work, and are there foods that are tied to inflammation? And I think 10 years ago I had this huge list, and I would kind of recommend. And then the problem that I ran into is one size doesn't fit all, and what I react to you don't react to, and it's become this really interesting kind of almost game of whack-a-mole where hey, here's a bunch of foods that people don't really react to. But, I've seen people that have terrible reactions to gluten, and I've seen other people that haven't. Now, is there a performance gain for me eating a ton of gluten-based stuff? No. So is there other carb choices that I can, select other than gluten? Yeah, I've never seen anybody really with any reaction to white rice other than like one dude who said, hey, he had terrible blood sugar reactions to it. So I tend to kind of look at it and say, all right, like, hey, like one ingredient, eat real foods. The old man I used to train with, Zangus, used to say nobody got strong eating out of a vending machine. And I always thought that was a pretty good deal, basing it around protein and then kind of adding in the other stuff. But, for supplements, I'm real big. I've still been a big believer and recommend people take creatine. I also read a bunch of studies that talked about athletes that have a ton of, chronic brain trauma from like concussions or from hitting with their heads tend to be very low in glutamine. So I usually recommend those guys supplement with glutamine, some form of essential amino acids. And then at the end of the day, like all the other stuff is really based upon you as an individual. Like I can, but the problem is, and I'm sure you have seen this way too many times with your athletes, athletes tend to get most of their nutrition advice from like what I call like the bro. Like, hey bro, like what are you doing for supplements? And then some guy's like, oh, I took this supplement and I feel really great. You take it and you don't get an effect. And you're like, well, maybe he was low in something and the copper or whatever he was taking made him feel better because he was, micronutrient deficient. You might not be micronutrient deficient, or you might have low-level inflammation that binds up receptor sites that prevents you from absorbing that stuff. So I think that there's some like underlying factors for why things happen, but without some form of testing or something more advanced, it's just kind of like throwing stuff against the wall, see what sticks.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's definitely the people who have those insufficiencies or deficiencies, obviously the ones that are going to get the most bang for their buck when we start to top those things up, whether it's food or supplementation. And, I love the idea of, setting protein intake first, because just as you mentioned, I mean, not only do you get the protein that you need to recover and, as Prof. Stu Phillips says, put the bricks back in the wall, but as protein intake goes up, so does micronutrient density. So you're going to bring on board more of the selenium, the zinc, the magnesium, all the things that you're looking for in the diet. So that's a great place to start. And you talked about your work with the Naval Special Warfare. Obviously, in your career as a football player, I'm not sure how many, concussions you had or the effects of those. Obviously, brain health's, hot topic these days, and I imagine you do some work there as well. Can you talk a little bit about, your career and what you experienced, and then some of the work that you might do today with athletes or within the military?
Yeah, so when I came in the NFL, they told us that you knew when you get a concussion when you got knocked unconscious. And then at the end of my NFL career, 10 years later, I remember a similar conversation where you get a concussion if when you hit, you get any form of disorientation, like you hear a ringing, your eyes go cross-eyed, you feel like, your bell is rung, anything that involves a change in the normal state.
Talk about moving the goalposts, huh? From start of the career to the end of the career. Jeez.
So yeah, day one they told me, and I asked me how many concussions I'd had, and I'd only had one because I'd only ever really, I took a knee to the head and basically blacked out for about 2 seconds, and so I was like, I've only really had one concussion, and then 10 years later when they redefined it, they asked me how many concussions I had, and I was like, I don't know, 70,000. Like I didn't really know, but I know. At the end of my NFL career, I think it was in 2009 when I retired, I was contacted by Dr. Amen, who's out in Newport Beach, about getting into his. He was doing a study on NFL players for the NFL on brains, and so I went in and they did all this cognitive testing, intelligence testing. I mean, they basically put me through like 3 days battery of tests. Did a whole bunch of scans and CT scans, CAT scans, MRIs. They did every scan they could of the brain and the neck. And at the end of 3 days, I go in and Dr. Amen, sits me down and goes, we got good news and bad news. I was like, well, I always like the bad news first. And he goes, well, the part of your brain that's damaged is on your left frontal lobe. And, we can tell based off of all the research that we've done how long you've played and what position you played. And I was like, great. And he goes, well, we know you have somewhere, anywhere like north of like 100 career starts. And they had a really pretty interesting way of attacking it. And we know that, you predominantly played on this side of the line, which is true, but, they could go and research this shit the same way too. They could just Google me.
Yeah.
So the area they talked about was this kind of left side of this left frontal cortex. And they went through and were like, this is the part that your brain's damaged, and these are the issues associated with it. Like it's, it deals more with like emotion and sympathy and empathy, and they kind of went through this whole deal. And I was like, oh shit, like so I got brain damage, which is kind of an interesting, like people know, but seeing it in real time is a different
animal, yeah, for sure.
So then I'm like, what's the good news? And he's like, well, all your cognitive testing came back great. He goes, you were the smartest guy we've ever tested, and highest IQ, you're cognitive, you're this, and memory, everything was off the charts. And I was like, then my question is like, are you comparing this against everybody or just the NFL guys? And they're like, well, this is in the NFL study. I'm like, well, dude, that's like being like the best looking kid in the other class.
At least you got a prize, right?
Yeah. So I left there, and I remember I was pretty depressed, like thinking like, oh shit, like, because the brain's pretty, anybody that says they understand the brain, I think is reaching at best. We had Tara Swart, who's wrote a really cool book called The Source, and she's got like an MD and a PhD in like, in like the brain and like neurology, and just really, really heady. And she even said, she's like, we are still learning daily about how the brain functions, and things that we thought 10 years ago don't exist anymore. And, we got into neuroplasticity, but at the time I kind of had this idea that, if your brain is damaged, like there's really nothing they can do. I mean, there's very few things they can get across the blood-brain barrier that they can give you. Is there a way to fix this stuff? And I remember I reached out. I have a buddy who's also another Canadian. My mom's from Vancouver, so I recognize the accent. But,
nice. I went to UBC. There you go.
Oh, did you?
Love Vancouver.
Yeah, no, all my cousins, my mom grew up in Vancouver, and all my cousins and family live on the island. And, so it's, I reached out to my buddy, Matt Lalonde, who is a doctor of organic chemistry at Harvard. And we've just been, buddies. I help him with training, and he's always forwards me some really amazing research. And I told him, I'm like, man, I got this, brain issue. I got this damage. And, is there anything that you've read, or is there any research you can pull about how to not only manage but deals or a way to fix it? And he's like, let me work on it. And he hit me back like 3 days later. And I guess he had his team of monkeys pull a whole bunch of 10,000 research articles.
Yeah.
And their idea was that there was some really interesting cognitive improvements for people that had both acute and chronic brain trauma using ketogenic diets. And, so obviously having done a cyclical ketogenic diet, I knew a ton about it, but I had never really done a prolonged ketogenic diet. So I basically, from that day, I set a marker for 1 year, 365 days that I would eat zero carbohydrate, and pretty much ate no carbs, drank no alcohol, really just drank like water and green tea. And ate a keto, very, very strict ketogenic diet. Now, I always ate I never really liked the recommendations on the ketogenic diet because the protein content was so low.
Mm-hmm.
So what I did is I backed into my calories, figured out what I wanted to hit in my protein, which was like 0.8 grams per pound of body weight. And then I backed into fat, and then started checking ketones. And I was pretty deep in ketosis for over 12 months. And I remember I went and saw Rob Wolf. I remember right at right around that time, and I was like, "Man, I'm coming up on my 1 year." And he's like, "Well, you want to try some carbs?" And I remember we went out and got all these big Japanese sweet potatoes, and I remember eating the sweet potatoes, and it was like this warm feeling came over me, and I felt like dramatically better. And then fast forward probably about a year after that. I was, like I said, I was working for Naval Special Warfare as a contractor. A couple of the guys that were on the SEAL teams came up to Newport Beach, and where I was living at the time, and hit me up because there was another doctor in Newport that was doing research on brain patterning and behavior on elite special forces, and SOCOM, like guys that were tier 1 operators, to see if they could put a series of tests in place so that they could pre-screen candidates and not waste time. So they found that there was all these different markers that were were all very unique and to these individuals that allowed them to do their job. And the military figured, instead of bringing in 10,000 people and figuring out the 100, why don't we pre-screen them and figure out the people that have the best chance based off of all these different markers? And So these guys came up, I went over and I thought it was interesting. I met the doc, and when I explained to him who I was and what I did, he's like, dude, we've been doing this for professional athletes. Would you want to get into the scans in this? And I was like, yeah, let's do it. And he scanned my brain, similar kind of what Eamon did, and did not find any damage on my left frontal lobe, on my left frontal cortex.
Wow.
So either Dr. Eamon's study was flawed and he was doctoring it, or this guy was, or we legitimately saw the brain heal itself.
Yeah, I mean, it's such an incredible space at the moment in terms of, the research on the brain and what we can do from a nutritional standpoint. And as you mentioned here, I mean, nutritional ketosis being a potential vehicle, the ketones being able to fuel the brain, and even research showing that, supplemental ketones can get us into that space without necessarily having to go full keto. But that's, especially having a case study like that as somebody who's been through it. I mean, that's obviously a really powerful thing. And, symptom wise and how you felt, did that sort of go along with the findings?
Yeah, it was interesting. About the time I started it, I remember a good friend of mine called me on the phone, and we had a conversation, and then I called him the next day, and we had another conversation. And when we got done, he's like, hey man, just give you a heads up, we talked yesterday. And I was like, yeah, I know we talked. He's like, we just had the same conversation. I was like, we did? He's like, yeah. He's like, do you remember we talked about it? I was like, I know we talked. I was like, but we had this, are you sure? He's like, yeah, dude, we had the same conversation. And I was like, shit, that ain't good. He's like, no, that ain't good at all. And so, and then that same friend, I remember a couple years later, was like, man, I was really nervous that day. And he's like, to see the cognitive change and to just, see the evolution of where it's come has been really pretty amazing. And, but I think it's more than that. I think it's kind of like an osteophyte or like a bone chip or something, in the joint. It causes a lot of pain and there's discomfort, and you can't move, and here the joint gets damaged, and then all of a sudden you go in and you remove it, and then all of a sudden the joint is able to move pain free and there's less inflammation in here. So I think sometimes when you remove the stressor, which would be this constant, beating of your head into another individual, and then you back it off and and then you figure out, micronutrient wise, where you're deficient, you put some, tools. And so the ketogenic diet to me is really powerful tool. The problem is that people aren't using it as a tool. I used it to fix something, and I think it has its place. But in terms of living your whole life on a ketogenic diet, for a healthy individual, I don't necessarily recommend. And the other thing which kind of blows me away, and maybe you could shed light on this for me, is why is it that the majority of people that are making dietary and kind of nutrient recommendations are usually doing it because they fix some form of pathology, but then people are looking at it and they're trying to extrapolate performance out of this. For example, the carnivore diet has become kind of a hot deal, and all the people that are doing the carnivore diet are feeling how amazing they are. And then you have people like the guys that we work with in Naval Special Warfare. They're like, well, hey, we want to try this carnivore diet. People are doing great. I'm like, okay, if you're so metabolically broken, your gut is so inflamed that the only nutrient that you can consume without distress is red meat, that is a terrible indicator of metabolic flexibility and health, because we know that the healthiest people can eat the most diverse diets. So stop trying to extrapolate performance from somebody's, diet fixes to fix their fucking pathology and their sickness. And that's the part, with the ketogenic diet, when people ask me well, it's a performance diet. And I'm like, it was for me at the time when I used it to fix my brain, but I never ate a pure ketogenic diet when I was playing. I used a cyclical keto, which allowed me to carb cycle, which was really good at the time for changing body composition. So I used that, but then when we got into season, I ate a more balanced kind of isocaloric diet. And, it's just really kind of a little frustrating to me that you have people that are purposely creating these very, very narrow guidelines for themselves because they think that it'll lead to some performance promised land.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a tricky space, right? Because everyone doesn't realize the blind spots of, you see it with, now it's vegan diets. And of course, a lot of the benefits people get is they stop eating a lot of processed food and junk food. And, so there's a lot of other reasons why people end up getting benefits. And just as you mentioned, I mean, obviously for you, I mean, what a great advantage to have a guy like Mauro in your corner throughout your career. I mean, it's, you're not sort of going at this ad hoc and reading some articles and whatnot. So that plays a huge role as well. And, just as you mentioned, it's hard for people to grasp on both sides of the line, actually, that you're going to eat a certain way to perform at elite level, and you're going to eat differently if you're, working at a desk 9 to 5 and you're 40 pounds overweight. And it's just, that idea of tools is a great metaphor, because they really are, they're tools, and, sounds like you've obviously used them for, great advantage throughout your career. And obviously with recovering from things like head trauma, which even today, I mean, for regular folk who are just working 9 to 5 as well, things like car accidents, falls, when, it can really change your life when you're, as you've experienced, you can't remember things anymore and that type of thing. So,
well, the other one too, and this is just purely observation. I have no research to support this. This is just, I've forever, through my entire life, I always look for patterns. Like patterns is something that's been universal for me. And I think it was probably the reason I was probably a pretty good football player, because when I can watch things enough, I can start to see the patterns. And then you get to the point where you watch film and, you go up and play against a team, and every time they're in this defense, or this guy's in this position, or the linebacker standing there, or the safeties, or if we're in this down and distance in the red zone here, we know that they bring and they have tendencies. And I would start to see patterns, and I could call things out. I'm like, they're going to blitz here, they're going to do this. And you just naturally following patterns. And it's just, see how I put this, it's just interesting with the nutrition, within training, that there are some really, really fundamental things that are universal that you can't really avoid. You brought up nutrient density, eating the most nutrient dense foods, eating red meat. At the end of the day, there is no substitute. I don't care, the vegans, pea protein, whatever, that the nutrient density of something like an animal based protein is dramatically higher. And there's more just quality things within that than eating this. Now, could you do something else? Yeah. But at the end of the day, that's a fix, not what's optimal. So, I mean, I found that I found that there was a remarkable difference in body composition and physical appearance of people that lifted weights with over 85% of their 1RM who lifted heavier weights than people that didn't. And so a lot of guys in the NFL are big, strong dudes, but they don't really lift heavy weights. I watched guys who, were 300 pounds, never put more than 315 on a barbell back squat. Wow. And they would do it for, 8, 9, 10 reps, and they were good. And then they asked me, and they're like, dude, you got 600 pounds on the bar. And I'm like, yeah, I can squat that for, 3, 4, 5 reps. And they were like, why would you squat so heavy? And I'm like, because I had to gain muscle and to continue to perform, I have to forever be fighting to get stronger. And the day that all of a sudden I'm like, well, that's good, and I don't ever put more than 315 on the bar, my body will have accommodation. And I always really pushed the weights, and hey, if I could do one more rep, I always fought for one more rep. And there was always this idea that hey, what's the most optimal rep range? And I remember Arnold said it the next one. If you can get 6, try for 7. If you can get 7, it was 8, and I always kind of, pretentiously put weight on the bar. But I also noticed within myself, just physically, stature wise, that training heavier weights allowed for not only a more dense muscle, but everything just physically, the appearance was different. And when people were like, oh, you stay pretty lean, I'm like, dude, but I also lift heavy weights. You guys don't really lift heavy weights. And when I do lift those heavy weights, I'm trying to break them. And so, and then at the other one, I ask guys constantly, I'm like, how many calories do you eat in a day? No idea. I'm like, that's crazy. That's like you going in the weight room and just having somebody throw weight on and not knowing ever what's on the bar. I was real big on hey, I'm only going to count protein. Once I get my protein in, I'm just going to eat, and kind of supplement it. But for the most part in the off season, I was super dialed on hey, this is how many calories I've had. This is what I'm trying to hit. And then I, got up every morning, weighed myself. I'd get my body fat done, and I'd just, do the mirror check, and then also know what I was able to do in the weight room. And as long as everything was trending positively, I was headed in the right direction. And it didn't seem like rocket science. And what I found was that people were trying to really make this thing complex, where I was like, hey, if you can develop an aerobic base, if you can lift heavy weights and do it with a lot of violent intent, and you can eat enough protein, and I can get, an inordinate, 6, 7, 8 hours of sleep, that's really the best that I can hope for.
There's the big rocks right there, right?
Yeah. and it's like like I haven't had a chance to read your book, and I usually, like, if I'm going to be on somebody's podcast or we have somebody on ours, I usually like to read their book ahead of time just so I can understand, how it, the writing and this. And so I
definitely will send you over a copy. No worries.
Oh, yeah, no, I'd love to read it. But it's pretty amazing how there's some pretty basic principles for this thing that are hard to ignore. Like, the greatest determining factor for longevity is muscle mass. The person that can maintain the most amount of muscle mass the longest tends to live the longest, because how do people, healthy old people, what do? They fall, they break a hip, they're bedridden, and all of a sudden that's the end of it. And so, like, as we age, a few things happen. We lose, motor unit recruitment and mitochondrial density. So, like, how do you recruit motor units? You got to lift some weights. If you got to build an aerobic base to keep your mitochondrial filled volume up, then we do that. And so these very fundamental basic principles, like, haven't changed in, millions of years. And like, every time I see things like game changers in here and nutrition's approaches in this, and I'm like, it feels like people are trying to add complexity so that they can sell something or doing this, because at the end of the day, the simple basic stuff that works is really unsexy and really hard to sell.
There you go. Yeah, I mean, being an expert in the fundamentals for sure, and it is frustrating when the bulk of the evidence just points to all these things that are, as you mentioned, just kind of not so sexy. But it's like we got to always keep spinning, the shiny new toy at people and sort of confusing them, when really they could just put one, brick on top of the next, and in the long run they're going to get there pretty quick. So.
Yeah, and then the other thing is, and I blame this on the iPhone generation, that everybody wants everything right now. And, like I have a nutrition, like I'll take on a very small amount of private clients. Like, we have a ton of distance stuff. Like, we have a methodology course where we work with strength coaches and performance coaches. That's online and in person, but that's kind of like at arm's distance. And then we have about 4,000 to 5,000 athletes a day that we work with remotely through programs that are through, an interface. But I work with a few one-on-one clients. And I got one guy who's, ex-football player, let himself go. He's 352 pounds, 6'5", big dude. And it's pretty funny in that, hey, to lose weight, you're going to have to eat 1,000 calories and go to CrossFit or F45 7 days a week. And he got into this, and of course, got down to 260 and then ballooned back up to 365, and has been in this yo-yo diet. And like, as I got him into this, and I was like, hey man, like, let's get all your blood work done. Let's kind of back it off. Like, I'm not interested in like dramatic weight gains. Like, if you lost a half a pound to a pound a week, like, over the course of like a year, if we lost 50 pounds and it was sustainable, I'm more than happy than you losing 100 and then coming back 125. And my thing is, like, how long does it take to get strong? Like, if I asked, if I walked into a gym, or if I saw you training and I was like, hey, hey doc, like, how long does it take to get strong? You'd probably look at me and say a lifetime. And how do you ever know you're strong enough? Like, nobody's ever happy with where they are. And so, like, with nutrition, there's this idea of like, hey, I have a start point and a finish point, and when I finish at my goal, then I'll just go back to my own shitty life. And my whole deal is like, I'd rather take a year and do this slow and teach you like the fundamentals of this thing, so that you can make a life change, so that it's just not a sprint. And I think this kind of, instant, like, oh, I've been following this program, I've been following this diet for a week, and I didn't see the gains I wanted. Like, to me, that's like that's how you sell people that, like it, but it's not sustainable. And like, the analogy, and I'm sure people will puke on this, but because I've told it so many times. Years ago, like many years ago, I have a buddy who's a really big time artist, and he was in Japan, and he ended up meeting up with these guys who were the traditional samurai sword makers. And their family had been making swords since like the 800s, and were like, the oldest sword maker in Japan. And so he brought home, and he's like, hey man, I'm going to get one of these swords. I would love a samurai sword. And so I gave him money and waited 10 years for them to make my sword. Right? Because they make them in a traditional, like they harvest the iron ore from a creek in their backyard. And then they take, I mean, it's the most amazing process, but they only make like 2 or 3 swords a year.
Incredible.
So it took 10 years to make this sword. And then I had to fly to Japan and meet these people. And then they like give it to you in a ceremony. Like they don't mail it. Like this thing is like a national treasure. So I get this sword. And before we had the ceremony, we were there all day and they showed us the whole process to make the sword. And like where they start from, like collecting, like they have this like this netting in the back where this huge river is, and they like collect all the iron ore there, and then they bring it in and they smelt it. And they took us through all the process, and it's like they fold the steel, you know, thousands of times, and they hammer and heat and reheat. As I'm seeing this, I'm like, this is the greatest metaphor for training I've ever seen. Like you heat the steel, you hammer it, you let it cool. You come back once it's cool, you heat it back up, you hammer it more, you let it cool, and you fold it over and over again. And then like all of those folds become different ridges and different cuts. And then that's what increases the lethality in the cut. And I'm like, so, and then I asked him, I'm like, well, could you, you know, is there a process? Like, could you do this faster? And the guy's like, it takes a certain amount of time to heat the metal. We can only hit it so much until it changes color, and then we have to let it cool. And then we heat it again, and there's the process. And they're like, you know, if we go faster, it becomes brittle. If we go slower, it doesn't take. So there's a cadence for it. I'm like, it's just like training. It's just like nutrition. It's just like all these things that, like, if you want to be, you know, the greatest sword in the world and you want to be an elite, like you got to fold the metal, you got to heat it, you got to do all this. And like, you know, you can go buy some $10 blade that was, you know, created in like a day, or you can wait 10 years for something that is, you know, only a few people on the planet have. And for me, I looked at like playing football and what I've done in life is like, this is my opportunity to fold the sword. And, you know, I've never claimed to have invented any of this stuff. And I just am really good about, you know, standing on the shoulders of giants and, you know, telling everybody that, like, you know, I just was lucky. I met a guy like Mauro who really helped me and really started me on this. And, you know, guys like Tom Incledon and, you know, all the strength coaches and really people that I've had around me for a lot of years. And then the fact that, you know, being fairly analytical and learning to read and, you know, looking for patterns, have just been able to kind of find some universal truths that have been very helpful.
Phenomenal, John. This has been a great conversation, man. Loads of terrific insights. I've saved the hardest question here for last. Who's going to win the Super Bowl on Sunday?
I think the Kansas City Chiefs.
Nice.
I think the Chiefs are going to do it.
Chiefs are going to do it. Any score predictions, or is this a close game, blowout?
I don't know. You know, the last 2 games the Chiefs have played, they've started slow and they've let people get up on them, and then they've come roaring back. And I'll just tell you, you know, I obviously played for Andy Reid in Philly, and I played in Kansas City. And
I was going to say,
well, you know, Andy is, you know, went to the Super Bowl. I played in 3 NFC Championship games with him, and then I went to Kansas City, and then that 4th one they won and went to the Super Bowl and lost to the Patriots. So this is his 2nd time back. There's going to be some redemption, and that Patrick Mahomes kid, I think, is pretty phenomenal. I know when I was watching the game, I texted some of my old teammates, like, man, if only we had this kid. I mean, Trent Green and those guys were good, but man, this kid's real special. And he just does some really amazing things. And the NFL has really changed. Like, if you watch him out there playing, like, the defense doesn't really want to hit a quarterback in the open field anymore. So because they are, you know, a little apprehensive and playing with kid gloves and not trying to hit him, it allows those guys to do some really amazing things that look like something out of a video game. So not that I don't think the Niners are good, but I think Kansas City is, you know, it's a long time coming for that franchise. And I just, you know, hope that they can go out and make good on it.
Amazing. Chiefs on Sunday. That sounds good. John, appreciate the time. Appreciate all the tremendous insights. You know, where's the best place for people to stay connected with you and keep up with all your fantastic work?
I'm easy to find. You can find me at Power Athlete. The URL is powerathletehq.com. If you Google Power Athlete, I usually come up, and, you know, johnwelbourn.com will take you to my blog, Talk to Me Johnny, which is really just based off of one of my favorite movies called Rambo's First Blood, which, you know, John Rambo, aka Talk to Me Johnny. So
filmed in BC as well, right?
Yeah. And you can find me on social media at John Welbourn. So I'm on Instagram and all that stuff. So I'm pretty easy to find.
Amazing. We'll definitely include all those links in the podcast summary. John, appreciate it again, man. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.